Home is often seen as safety, but for many it means confinement, control, and unwanted permanence. Walls, locks, and furniture can trigger fear rather than comfort. Shelters built to protect often repeat this harm with harsh lighting, blind corners, and surveillance that feel more like punishment than refuge. This episode asks whether a home can exist without feeling like one. It explores how design can offer safety without confinement, privacy without isolation, and freedom without chaos. Through history, psychology, and experiments, the goal is to imagine spaces where those who hate homes might finally rest. A home is often thought of as a place of comfort, safety, and stability. For many people, it represents the center of daily life and identity. Yet not everyone feels this way. For some, the very idea of home can create discomfort, fear, or even resentment. When asked to step into what most would call a normal domestic space, a living room, a bedroom, or a kitchen, they may experience unease instead of relief. Understanding this reaction requires us to examine the roots of what we might call a hatred of homes, and to explore why traditional domestic settings can feel unsafe or undesirable. The roots often lie in trauma. A home is not always a sanctuary. For some, it has been a site of abuse, neglect, or control. In these cases, the walls and doors that others view as protective are linked with memories of harm. A child who grew up in such an environment may come to see domestic spaces as traps rather than safe havens. As an adult, walking into a similar setting can revive old associations of being stuck with no way out. The sense of permanence, rather than providing security, makes the experience worse. Solid walls remind them of confinement and a lack of choice. Think about someone who lived in a household where conflict was constant and unavoidable. For them, the front door did not signal safety, but a lock that kept them inside with the source of fear. Years later, that person may choose to avoid traditional houses or apartments. Instead, they might prefer transitional arrangements, shelters, temporary residencies, or even outdoor settings, because these allow for escape. What looks like comfort to most people feels like entrapment to them. Another factor is resistance to permanence. Many people long for stability, but for others, stability feels heavy. The commitment of signing a lease, decorating a bedroom, or settling into one address carries an emotional cost. For those who have experienced displacement, frequent moves, or unstable relationships, staying unattached can be a way of coping. They learn to travel light, avoid rootedness, and keep options open. Permanence, in this sense, feels like a burden. Picture someone who has spent years living abroad, working in different cities, or staying in shared hostels. Their lifestyle has been shaped by constant change and movement. To such a person, entering a fixed home with static furniture and assigned rooms can feel unnatural. They may prefer environments that allow for transience, where nothing requires ownership or long-term investment. The stillness of a permanent home disrupts the rhythm of their life, leaving them uneasy rather than grounded. Fear of confinement also plays a significant role. Homes are enclosed by design. Walls, windows, and doors create boundaries between inside and outside. For most, this separation creates privacy and safety. But for those who associate closed spaces with entrapment, it creates stress. A room with a single door, narrow corridors, or no view of the outdoors can provoke anxiety. This response is especially common among people who have experienced imprisonment, involuntary hospital stays, or controlling family dynamics. Their nervous system stays alert to the possibility of being trapped without escape. Think of a shelter room with one locked door and no windows. For someone sensitive to confinement, that space would feel unbearable. Sleep might be shallow, and the individual may avoid spending time there. By contrast, a large, open hall with several exits, even if it lacks comfort, may produce a stronger sense of safety. In this case, openness matters more than coziness. The ability to see a way out reduces the sense of danger. Rejection of domesticity adds yet another layer. Not every case stems from trauma or anxiety. Some people simply reject the cultural expectation that home is central to a good life. They may feel alienated by the emphasis on ownership, decor, and permanence. Instead of seeing home as a symbol of success, they view it as conformity. For them, living outside the bounds of traditional domestic life is a choice tied to identity and self-expression. Consider an artist who thrives in temporary residencies, co-living studios, and collective workshops. Their creative process depends on openness and change. Placing them in a suburban home with fenced yards and assigned rooms may feel restrictive, as though their freedom has been traded for predictability. In this scenario, rejection of home is not about fear, but about autonomy and lifestyle. To better understand these reactions, psychology offers useful frameworks. Place attachment theory explains how people form bonds with spaces through positive experiences and routines. When those experiences are negative, the bond can weaken or even reverse. A home might then symbolize alienation instead of belonging. For someone who hates homes, this lack of attachment is not just absence, but inversion. The very idea of home brings discomfort. Environmental psychology helps us see how physical features influence feelings and behavior. A dimly lit room with cluttered furniture may feel cozy to one person, but suffocating to another. An open space with natural light and clear pathways might reduce stress for someone sensitive to confinement. These variations show how built environments interact with personal histories. The same physical layout can produce comfort or discomfort, depending on who is inside it. Trauma-informed design adds another dimension. This approach asks how to create spaces that avoid triggering painful memories. It emphasizes safety, choice, and control. Instead of assuming everyone wants the same features in a home, trauma-informed design recognizes diversity in needs. For people who hate homes, this means creating environments that do not enforce permanence, that offer multiple exits, and that allow for flexibility in layout. Privacy is offered, but never imposed. The design adapts to the individual, not the other way around. This leads to the framing of the experiment. If traditional homes are a problem for some, what alternatives might work? Should we design shelters that provide safety without pressing people into domestic routines? Or should we explore new definitions of what home itself can mean? Perhaps home does not need to equal permanence. Perhaps it can be fluid, offering refuge without control. Imagine two experimental spaces. One is a standard shelter room with a bed, a desk, and a locked door. The other is modular, with movable partitions, open layouts, and multiple exits. Participants spend time in each space while researchers record their stress levels, sleep quality, and daily habits. Do participants report more comfort in the flexible environment? Do they spend more time inside when they can rearrange the space? These observations would reveal whether design can shift the aversion. The experiment could go further by gradually introducing elements of traditional homes. Privacy nooks, personal items, and semi-permanent layouts could be added one at a time. The goal would be to see where discomfort begins. At what point does the space tip from tolerable refuge to unwanted home? Understanding that threshold could help architects and psychologists design shelters that meet needs without forcing domestic ideals. The key is not to erase the rejection of homes, but to respect it. For some, the concept of home will always be loaded with discomfort, but design can still create safe, flexible spaces that serve as refuges. By offering choice, openness, and the possibility of escape, such spaces may provide the safety that traditional homes cannot. The challenge is not to persuade people to embrace home, but to rethink what a home can be when the very idea feels hostile. Traditional shelters did not begin as places designed to make people feel safe or cared for. Their history shows how they often developed as institutions of control rather than refuge. In the 19th century, workhouses in Britain and poorhouses in the United States were set up less to provide comfort and more to enforce discipline among those who had nowhere else to go. The idea was that shelter should never be too attractive, or else it might encourage dependence. People in need were placed under strict rules, often segregated by gender or ability, and watched over by staff who acted more like wardens than helpers. These spaces were not homes in any sense of the word. They were instruments of order, meant to keep the poor visible, contained, and under surveillance. That legacy did not vanish with time. Many modern shelters still echo that model in their layouts and rules. Long dormitories, lined with rows of beds, strict curfews, and security cameras may not differ much in spirit from the poorhouses of the past. A person walking into such a shelter may feel they are entering a place of punishment rather than one of rest. The unspoken message is that survival is permitted, but comfort is not. When the built environment carries this message, it can shape how residents think of themselves and of the system that surrounds them. The architecture of control is not abstract. It shows itself in specific details of shelter design. Blind corners in hallways can make a person feel unsafe since they never know who or what might be around the bend. Poor lighting adds to this, creating shadows and obscuring sightlines. For someone with a history of trauma, these features can be more than annoyances. They become triggers that set the body into high alert, raising stress and making sleep difficult. Instead of calming the mind, the environment reproduces the conditions of threat. Forced communal living is another defining feature of many shelters. Dozens of people may sleep side by side in one large room with no partitions or privacy screens. This arrangement is efficient for staff since it allows easy supervision. But for residents, it often feels degrading. Imagine trying to rest while strangers shift, snore, or argue only a few feet away. Every sound and movement is shared, and there is little control over who ends up beside you. For many, this loss of privacy is not a small inconvenience, but a major source of distress. The sense of being constantly watched, both by staff and peers, strips away autonomy. Consider the experience of a woman escaping domestic violence who enters a shelter with 50 beds in one hall. She may lie awake at night, hyper-alert to every sound, worried about theft or reminded of past threats. The very setting intended to provide safety instead deepens her sense of exposure. For her, the shelter is not a place of recovery, but a place of survival at best. This example illustrates how a poorly designed environment can undo the goals of social support. The aesthetics of many shelters add to the problem. Cinder-block walls, bolted-down furniture, and linoleum floors resemble institutions like prisons or hospitals. These materials are chosen for durability and low cost, but they also communicate a lack of care. Residents may feel they are not worth the effort of design that respects their dignity. Contrast this with a space that uses warm colors, natural light, and comfortable seating. The difference in mood is striking. Yet in many shelters, the institutional look prevails, reinforcing the impression that residents are less than full citizens. The perception of shelters as punitive extends beyond their walls. Many people who are unhoused avoid shelters altogether, even when sleeping outside exposes them to cold or danger. They describe shelters as places where dignity is taken away, where they feel disrespected by staff, or where rules make life harder rather than easier. Some compare them to prisons, not only in appearance but in daily routine. Strict intake procedures, searches, bans on personal items, and rigid schedules create the sense that entry into a shelter means giving up basic freedoms. For people already struggling with autonomy, this can be intolerable. Take the case of someone with a job that runs late into the night. If the shelter enforces a curfew of 10 p.m., that person faces a choice: keep the job or keep the bed. When the rules do not align with the realities of life, people are forced to stay outside. Another person may avoid shelters because of past experiences with theft or assault inside dormitories. To them, the street feels less dangerous than the exposure of communal sleeping. These decisions may look irrational from the outside, but when seen from the perspective of lived experience, they reflect careful risk management. Psychological triggers embedded in shelter design do not only affect those with known trauma histories. Even without past trauma, constant noise, lack of control, and absence of privacy can erode mental health. Crowded dormitories can heighten irritability and conflict. Dim lighting can worsen depression. Limited access to fresh air or natural light can disrupt sleep cycles. Over time, the stress of living in such conditions compounds the difficulties residents already face. The shelter may provide a roof, but it can also reinforce the sense of exclusion and helplessness. It is important to recognize that these patterns are not accidents. They result from choices about cost, control, and management. Building wide hallways with clear sightlines, offering smaller rooms, or using materials that feel less institutional often requires more resources. Administrators must balance budgets and staffing concerns. Yet the consequences of neglecting design are significant. When people avoid shelters because they feel unsafe or degraded, the investment fails its purpose. The empty bed does not solve homelessness, and the street becomes the more tolerable option. There are shelters that attempt to move away from this model, but the dominant perception remains. Among unhoused communities, stories of negative experiences circulate widely. Word of mouth spreads warnings about overcrowded dorms, harsh staff, or theft. These stories shape decisions as much as official policies do. A person who hears that a shelter resembles a prison may decide never to set foot inside, even if they have never been there themselves. Perception, in this case, has as much weight as reality. In daily practice, the problem of traditional shelters is that they often confuse survival with dignity. They provide the minimum: food, a bed, protection from weather, while stripping away the qualities that make people feel like human beings with agency. This tension lies at the heart of why many unhoused people see shelters as a last resort. They will use them when there is no other option, but they do not see them as places to rest or rebuild. Instead, they are stopgaps, endured rather than embraced. To understand the hatred of homes, it helps to see the parallel in how people respond to shelters. Both represent enclosed spaces that claim to provide safety but often feel like control. Both can act as triggers for those sensitive to confinement, surveillance, or loss of autonomy. By studying the failures of traditional shelters, we see more clearly why some reject the idea of home altogether. The lesson is that without design that respects dignity, safety, and choice, even a space meant to protect can become a place to avoid. When traditional shelters feel harsh or unsafe, one response is to ask how they might be designed differently. Trauma-informed design offers a clear path forward. It begins with the idea that people who use shelters often carry histories of trauma. Instead of ignoring that fact, the design process acknowledges it and works to prevent the environment from repeating harmful patterns. The aim is not to provide luxury or decoration, but to create spaces where stress is reduced and control is restored to the individual. Safety is the first principle. Safety here means both physical and psychological. A person must be able to trust that the walls, doors, and exits protect them rather than trap them. This requires careful choices in layout. Hallways should be wide, with clear sightlines, so that no one feels ambushed around a blind corner. Doors should not be hidden or locked in ways that make escape seem difficult. Windows should allow natural surveillance of the outside without leaving residents feeling exposed. For example, in one redesigned shelter, glass panels were placed in entry doors so that residents could see who was approaching before opening them. That simple change reduced tension at points of entry and gave people a greater sense of control. Privacy is the next principle. In shelters where dozens of beds are arranged in one large room, residents lose control over their most basic personal boundaries. Trauma-informed design offers privacy in ways that do not isolate. Small sleeping pods with partial walls, curtains, or acoustic panels can give individuals a defined space while still allowing staff oversight. Even the ability to turn one's back to others without fear of intrusion can make the difference between rest and exhaustion. Consider a dormitory where residents sleep in open view of each other, compared to one where movable partitions allow each person to create a small nook. In the second case, people report sleeping more deeply and feeling less threatened, even though the overall space remains communal. Empowerment ties safety and privacy together. It means giving residents choices. Trauma often strips people of agency. A shelter that repeats that loss by controlling every movement only deepens the harm. Empowerment through design might involve allowing residents to rearrange furniture, control lighting at their bed, or choose whether to sit in a social lounge or a private nook. Even small decisions matter. In one facility, residents were allowed to personalize their area with fabric panels or artwork. Staff noticed that incidents of conflict declined because people felt a sense of ownership and pride over their space. Transitions between different types of space are another core idea. Trauma-informed design pays close attention to how people move from indoors to outdoors, or from public to private zones. Abrupt changes can feel jarring, while gradual transitions create comfort. For instance, instead of placing a front door that opens directly into a crowded hall, a shelter might include a small entry vestibule with seating and natural light. This gives residents a chance to adjust as they move from the public street into the more private interior. The same principle applies inside. Large communal spaces should flow into smaller, semi-private areas where people can step back without disappearing. These transitions mirror natural environments, where landscapes shift gradually rather than suddenly. Wayfinding is also critical. Many shelters are confusing to navigate, with long identical hallways and poorly marked doors. For a resident already stressed, this confusion adds to the sense of helplessness. Clear sightlines, distinct colors, and logical layouts reduce this burden. When people can orient themselves easily, they feel safer and more confident. For example, using natural light as a guide, placing windows at hallway ends helps residents understand direction without needing signs. Choice in navigation is part of this as well. If there is only one path from the dormitory to the dining hall, people may feel herded. Multiple routes allow them to choose their movement, reinforcing autonomy. Sensory richness is another part of the model. Institutional spaces often strip away variation. White walls, buzzing fluorescent lights, and hard surfaces create monotony. This can be overstimulating in some ways and understimulating in others. Trauma-informed spaces add variation in color, texture, and sound. Natural materials like wood or fabric soften the environment. Access to daylight stabilizes circadian rhythms and improves mood. Outdoor areas, whether gardens or small courtyards, offer fresh air and a change of scenery. In one case study, a shelter that introduced skylights and murals noticed an improvement in resident mood and participation in activities. The sensory environment does not have to be extravagant. It only needs to signal care and provide relief from the starkness of institutional design. Organized complexity is the final principle. This means creating environments with a balance of variety and order. Too much uniformity feels oppressive, while too much chaos overwhelms. A trauma-informed space might include different types of seating areas, some open for groups, some semi-enclosed for pairs, and some private for individuals. The variety allows each person to find what fits their needs at a given moment. Multifunctional spaces are part of this approach. A large room might serve as a dining hall at one time and a community workshop at another. The ability to adapt space for different uses creates flexibility without disorder. Imagine a shelter designed with these principles in mind. As a resident enters, they pass through a vestibule filled with natural light, easing the transition from street to interior. They find a clear hallway with direct sightlines and soft colors marking each section. Along the way, alcoves offer quiet seating. The dormitory is divided into small pods with curtains, giving each person privacy while still allowing staff to monitor safety. Residents can move between a large lounge, a semi-private study area, and an outdoor courtyard, choosing their level of interaction. Skylights and warm materials reduce the sterile feel. The layout offers more than one route between spaces, so no one feels forced to follow a single path. In such a place, the environment itself supports healing rather than re-traumatization. These examples show that trauma-informed design is not an abstract theory, but a practical framework. It draws from psychology and architecture to respond to real human needs. When safety, privacy, empowerment, clear transitions, wayfinding, sensory richness, and organized complexity come together, the result is an environment where people who might otherwise avoid shelters feel more willing to stay. Instead of reproducing the control of old workhouses, the space becomes a site of dignity and choice. The NoHo Bridge Shelter in Los Angeles opened with a clear promise: food, beds, showers, case management, and a link to housing resources. It offered relief from street danger and weather. People could get a meal, a place to sleep, and a chance to meet with staff about IDs or benefits. Screening at the entry reduced weapons and protected residents from immediate threats. These are real gains, and for many, they meant survival. Yet the same features that increased control also shaped how the space felt. Rules guided every step. Intake was fast but invasive. Residents often described safety but not calm. The building worked as a triage site, not a place to restore the body and mind. Walk the interior, and you find narrow hallways that turn into blind corners. Fluorescent lights buzz and cast flat light. Windows sit high on walls or are scarce. Staff stations hold central positions with wide views of beds and corridors. The layout supports supervision and fast response. It also tells residents they are always on display. In a communal dorm, the lack of partitions makes every movement public. People cannot control light at a bed or shield a small area for rest. The message is simple: you are safe if you stay visible and follow the flow. For a man with past trauma, nights in that dorm can feel like going back to an unsafe home. He scans the room again and again. He sleeps in short bursts, holding a backpack against his chest. A woman who left a violent partner lies awake, listening to shoes on linoleum and murmured talk. She knows staff will intervene if trouble starts. Yet the room has one main exit, and she cannot see it from her cot. Her nervous system treats that unknown as risk. Before dawn, both residents feel drained. The shelter met the promise of a roof and a meal, but the environment multiplied their stress load. The psychological effect is not only about fear, it is also about identity. When cameras watch every corridor and rules govern every hour, people feel reduced to a case number. Intake forms, searches, and curfews serve a purpose. They also signal that trust runs one way. The shelter trusts itself, not the resident. That framing can lead to withdrawal, irritability, and conflict. Staff carry that weight as well. They must keep order in a system that offers few tools beyond surveillance and rules. Burnout rises when the building pushes staff to police rather than support. The Kearney Center in Tallahassee took a different path. It still runs dorms and follows procedures, but many design choices aim to lower stress. Public areas use daylight and art to humanize the space. Corridors include places to sit, so movement can pause without blocking traffic. Wayfinding is clear. Residents can see where they are and where they are going. There are rooms for services, health checks, and meetings that do not feel like holding cells. The finishes do not shout luxury, but they reduce the institutional feel and allow people to regulate their own comfort. A resident enters from the street and passes through a lobby that buffers the shift from outside to inside. Light comes from windows rather than only from overhead fixtures. Seating areas vary: open tables for groups, small alcoves for pairs, and nooks for one person. Staff remain present, yet they are not the only feature in view. The building offers choices. A teenager who needs quiet can find a corner. A veteran who prefers to keep watch can sit with a sight line to exits. No one has to stand in the middle of a crowd to feel safe. The effect shows up at night, in dorm areas. Headboards, curtains, or low partitions provide a small sense of enclosure. Residents can dim a reading light or angle a panel. The change seems minor, but the nervous system reads it as control. People fall asleep faster and wake less often. Staff report fewer fights over noise and space. The room still holds many beds, and the model still asks people to live in close quarters. Yet the layout treats them like adults who can manage their own bodies and time. That respect reduces tension. These two examples mark points on a spectrum. On one end, sit programs that borrow the logic of punishment. They value order over dignity and control over choice. Architecture mirrors that logic with hard edges, low visibility, and single routes. On the other end, sit trauma-informed settings that embed safety in design. They offer options, clear sightlines, and multiple ways to move. They make privacy possible without cutting staff off from residents. Most shelters land between these poles. The task is to move the baseline toward choice and calm without losing safety. For people who hate homes, this spectrum matters. The NoHo model may give them shelter and services, yet it can confirm every fear they hold about enclosed space. The Kearney approach, while not perfect, shows a path toward acceptability. It does not ask the resident to love a room. It asks the room to lower its demands on the resident. That shift can make the difference between a bed someone uses once and a setting they can return to while they rebuild. Choice is not a perk. It is a tool for regulation. Designers and operators can learn from both cases. Where surveillance is the first response, ask what the layout can do instead. Can a corridor widen and straighten to remove blind corners? Can dorms break into pods with curtains rather than rows of cots under a single light? Can the entry sequence add a small vestibule with seating and glass so arrivals do not collide with a crowd? None of these steps remove rules or safety checks. They change the posture of the building, so the rules do not carry the whole burden. Measure the results with sleep logs, incident reports, and resident surveys. When the numbers improve, the case for change writes itself. An experimental shelter design begins by asking how space itself can reduce stress for people who dislike the idea of home. The answer is not to mimic a domestic setting, but to create a different kind of environment where control, openness, and flexibility shape the experience. Every design principle works toward a single goal: making the space tolerable and even supportive for someone who feels confined or unsettled in traditional housing. Flexibility stands at the center of this approach. A fixed layout communicates permanence and control. Movable partitions, sliding panels, and furniture on wheels allow residents to change the space according to their needs. One evening, a large open area may serve as a group gathering spot. The next morning, the same space can break into smaller nooks for quiet activity. A person who feels anxious in crowds can push a chair into a corner, close off a partition, and make a private zone. Another resident may reel tables together to create a shared workspace. The ability to rearrange does more than change the layout. It signals to residents that they hold some authority over their environment. In traditional shelters, everything is nailed down, from beds to chairs. In the flexible design, nothing says you must accept the space as it is. You can adapt it. That freedom reduces the sense of being trapped. The aesthetic of the shelter matters as well. A standard domestic style, framed pictures, patterned rugs, lamps in corners, can feel heavy for someone who associates those features with painful memories. A non-domestic aesthetic avoids that trigger. Instead of looking like a living room or bedroom, the shelter may resemble a studio, a gallery, or even a workshop. Think of neutral walls that display changing art, modular furniture that looks like equipment rather than household decor, and lighting that recalls a shared community space instead of a home. For one resident, sitting at a long table under bright light may feel safer than lying on a bed with curtains. For another, an open studio-like layout may match their preference for spaces that do not echo traditional domestic settings. The absence of homely cues allows people to use the space without feeling forced into roles they have rejected. Privacy remains important, but it must be offered, not imposed. Traditional homes provide bedrooms that close with a door. For some, that closed room is a trigger. An experimental design uses opt-in privacy instead. Pods, alcoves, and curtains create spaces where people can retreat if they want, without demanding that they do so. Picture a central hall with open sight lines, where along the edges sit small alcoves. Each alcove has a curtain that can be drawn or left open. A resident feeling stressed can pull the curtain for an hour and then reopen it when ready to rejoin the group. This system prevents the sense of confinement while still granting choice. Curtains and movable partitions send a message. Privacy is available, but no one will shut you in. That distinction can mean the difference between panic and comfort. Another principle is de-ownership. In standard housing, possessions and permanence define the home. People arrange their own furniture, collect belongings, and guard them as signs of stability. For those who resist homes, that weight can feel unbearable. A shelter designed with de-ownership in mind removes that burden. Furniture and objects are shared, rotated, or borrowed. A chair does not belong to one person, but to anyone who uses it. Shelves may hold books that move between residents rather than personal collections. The design avoids fixed markers of identity and attachment. For example, instead of giving each resident a permanent locker, the shelter might offer bins that can be moved or exchanged. One week a person uses a bin, the next week they may not. This approach removes the pressure to accumulate or settle. While still providing function, it is not about denying people belongings, but about lowering the expectation that they must define themselves through possessions. Escape routes complete the design. A core fear for many who dislike homes is entrapment. A shelter that has only one exit or hallways that end in dead ends increases that fear. An experimental design builds in multiple exits and makes them visible. At any point in the space, a resident can see at least 2 clear ways out. Doors are wide, pathways direct, and signage clear. Even windows may open in ways that suggest escape, not just light. Imagine a resident sitting in the central commons. They see one exit to the garden and another exit to the main hall. Both are obvious. They know that if stress rises, they can leave quickly. This knowledge lowers anxiety, even if they never use the exits. The mere fact that the routes exist changes how the space feels. By contrast, in a traditional dorm with one locked door at the far end, the sense of confinement dominates every decision. These principles come together in daily use. A group enters the shelter after a long day. They find an open room with partitions on tracks. Some push the partitions back to create a large shared space for dinner. Others move them to form alcoves for quiet. Chairs roll into clusters or pairs depending on conversation. After dinner, one resident heads to a privacy nook, draws a curtain, and rests. Another sits at a long studio table, sketching under bright lights. The absence of domestic decor makes the space feel neutral, not demanding. Later, 2 residents leave through a side exit to the garden, while others head out the main hall. No one feels forced to stay in one place, use one layout, or accept one version of shelter. The space adapts to them rather than the other way around. This experimental approach does not erase rules or services. It still provides beds, meals, and staff oversight. What changes is how the environment supports residents. Safety comes not from surveillance alone, but from design that allows choice. Privacy is offered, but never forced. The absence of homely cues avoids triggers. Shared ownership reduces the pressure of permanence. Visible exits calm the nervous system. Each principle works on the small scale of daily actions: moving a chair, pulling a curtain, stepping through a different door. Over time, those small actions shift the relationship between residents and the idea of shelter itself. The experiment lies in testing whether these design choices reduce stress and make people more willing to use the space. If they do, then the shelter demonstrates that design can answer the needs of people who resist traditional homes. The principles are simple, but their impact is measured in lived experience: better sleep, lower tension, and a sense of dignity in a setting that avoids the traps of conventional domestic space. The floor plan of an experimental shelter tells a story through its layout. Every space, every wall, and every exit speaks to how people will feel when they move inside. Instead of copying the blueprint of a standard dormitory or apartment, this design puts flexibility, visibility, and personal choice at the center. Walking through the plan step by step reveals how each area addresses specific needs for those who dislike the feeling of home. The first and largest space is the open area, about 22 square meters. This zone functions as a commons rather than a living room. The size allows it to shift roles depending on how people use it. At one moment, residents may gather in small groups around tables for meals or discussion. At another, The same space can open into a wide hall for workshops, meetings, or quiet communal sitting. The key feature is that the furniture does not fix the purpose. Chairs, benches, and tables sit on wheels, so anyone can move them to form clusters or rows. The space does not dictate behavior, but supports it. For someone who fears the confinement of traditional homes, the openness signals freedom. Multiple exits lead out of the commons, so no one feels trapped at the center. A resident can see 2 or 3 clear routes out, and that sight reduces tension before it ever rises. Around this open area stand movable walls mounted on tracks. These panels allow the commons to transform into smaller rooms when needed. Residents can pull a wall to close off a section or push it back to open the space. Unlike fixed partitions, these walls make the environment responsive. Picture a group of residents who want to run a support circle. They slide 2 panels into place to create a semi-private enclosure. Later, when the gathering ends, the walls slide back and the area becomes part of the larger hall again. The power to change the layout rests in the hands of the residents, not only staff. That ability to reconfigure gives people a sense of control over their environment. It is not about luxury, but about autonomy. Trauma often comes from situations where control was stripped away, so restoring even small choices can help people feel safe. One of the most important features sits off the main area, the opt-in privacy nook, measuring about 8 square meters. Unlike a bedroom with a solid door, this nook offers privacy that a resident chooses to use or ignore. Sliding panels or thick curtains form the boundaries. If someone needs to withdraw, they can close the panels and block sightlines. If they feel comfortable, they can leave the panels open and remain part of the larger space. The key here is reversibility. Privacy does not lock them in, but responds to their decision. A resident who survived confinement in a past home may panic in a locked room, but in this nook, they know they can open the panels at any time. The choice transforms the experience of enclosure from one of control to one of safety. Near the commons is the alcove, also about 8 square meters. This space is a semi-private retreat with clear sightlines back to the larger hall. The alcove sits slightly recessed, offering enough separation to feel calmer without full isolation. It might hold a bench against the wall or 2 chairs angled toward each other. A resident can sit here to read, have a quiet conversation, or simply watch activity in the commons from a safe distance. The design avoids blind corners, so the alcove feels sheltered but not hidden. For someone who wants a balance between community and solitude, this middle ground offers comfort. They can step away without disappearing, which can help reduce social tension and encourage gradual engagement. The smallest feature is the nook, around 6.5 square meters. This space functions as a personal cocoon. Unlike the alcove, which is social in nature, the nook provides a space where one person can retreat completely. Natural light enters through a small window, preventing the claustrophobic feeling of a windowless cell. The nook's location near an exit adds another layer of reassurance. A resident who fears entrapment knows they can leave quickly if they wish. A simple chair, a shelf, or a mat might be all the furniture required. The value lies not in furnishing, but in scale and placement. The compact size makes it feel secure, while the proximity to an exit makes it feel safe. This combination allows people to rest without the fear that often comes with isolation. The final piece of the floor plan is the system of escape routes. Every major space connects to more than one exit, and every resident can see at least one from where they sit. The exits are wide, accessible, and clearly marked. No corridor dead ends in darkness. No door hides at the far end of a maze. Instead, the layout creates a loop so people always have an alternative path. In practice, this means that a resident in the commons sees both the door to the garden and the hall to the street. Someone in the nook sees the side exit. A person in the alcove sees a corridor that leads out to open air. These lines of sight lower anxiety. Even if residents never use the secondary exits, knowing they are there changes how safe the space feels. For people sensitive to confinement, this knowledge is not a detail, but a requirement. Together, these elements create a layered environment. The commons provides openness and adaptability. The movable walls allow empowerment through reconfiguration. The opt-in privacy nook offers control over boundaries. The alcove supports semi-private retreat without hiding. The nook provides personal refuge near escape. The exits guarantee freedom of movement at all times. Each feature works on its own, but the real strength comes from how they connect. A resident can move fluidly from open space to semi-private space to private space and back, always with options. The shelter does not force them into one way of living. It respects their need for movement, choice, and escape. Walking this floor plan in sequence shows how design can respond to fear of homes. Where a traditional shelter might offer rows of beds and one locked door, this layout offers variety, visibility, and choice. The resident becomes an active participant in shaping the space rather than a passive subject within it. By mapping principles of trauma-informed design directly onto square meters and partitions, the shelter becomes not a home, but a neutral refuge where people can renegotiate their relationship with space and safety. A psychological experiment that tests the design of shelters for people who dislike homes begins with a clear baseline. Before any intervention, researchers must measure how people respond to conventional shelters. This involves more than a quick survey at the door. It means recording levels of stress, comfort, and overall well-being during a stay in an existing facility. Stress can be measured using simple scales where residents rate how tense or calm they feel. Comfort can be tracked through questions about sleep quality, ease of using the space, and whether the environment feels safe. Well-being involves both physical and mental states, such as whether people feel rested, whether they avoid certain areas, and whether they engage with others. In addition to these self-reports, physiological measures can provide a more objective layer. Heart rate, breathing rate, and galvanic skin response all rise when stress increases, and portable sensors make it possible to record these indicators without intruding on daily routines. Taken together, these data provide a baseline picture of how conventional shelters affect the body and mind. Once the baseline is established, the experiment moves to intervention. Here the redesigned prototype comes into play. This prototype is not meant to look like a house or an apartment, but rather to serve as a neutral, flexible environment. The goal is to see whether a space designed to avoid the triggers of traditional homes can reduce stress and improve comfort. Residents who previously stayed in conventional shelters can then spend time in the prototype. Their responses are tracked in the same way: self-reports, behavioral observations, and physiological signals. The difference between the two environments reveals the impact of design alone. If people report sleeping better, feeling calmer, and avoiding fewer areas, then the prototype demonstrates its value. If their heart rate shows less fluctuation or their skin conductance drops, then the evidence becomes even stronger. Observation during this phase is critical. Researchers must not only record responses, but also notice how residents interact with the space. Do they use the movable walls to create small private zones? Or do they keep the area open? Do they gravitate toward the alcoves or spend most of their time in the commons? Do they sit near exits or in the middle? These behavior patterns tell us which features work and which need adjustment. A privacy nook that remains empty may not offer the right balance of openness and enclosure. An alcove that attracts constant use may point to the value of semi-private spaces. Observers must pay attention without intruding, using cameras, notes, or resident feedback to track use. Self-reports add depth, as residents can describe in their own words what feels supportive and what feels restrictive. The experiment does not end with one round of observation. Iteration is built into the design. The prototype can shift, adding or removing elements to see how residents respond. For example, if the space begins with minimal decoration and neutral walls, researchers may add softer lighting or art and record whether people accept or resist these changes. A bare commons may feel safe because it avoids domestic cues, but over time, residents might welcome touches that make the area feel warmer. By adjusting step by step, the experiment can map resistance thresholds. These thresholds mark the point where a non-home environment begins to feel too much like a home. For some residents, a curtain across a nook may be acceptable, but a closed door may trigger unease. For others, even a small shelf of books may feel too domestic. Recording these thresholds helps us understand the limits of design for those who carry trauma connected to home environments. To make the findings reliable, the experiment needs a structure that respects ethics and consent. Residents should know that they are part of a study, that their data is private, and that they can leave at any time. Participation should never be forced, since the entire goal is to give back control. Data should be anonymized, and feedback should be shared in ways that empower residents rather than labeling them. A resident might be told that their responses help shape future shelters, not that their stress scores mark them as unstable. The study must also recognize that participants may already carry heavy psychological burdens. Support staff should be present to provide help if the experiment stirs painful memories. One way to strengthen the study is to include mixed methods. Quantitative data such as heart rate, sleep logs, and survey scores provide numbers that can be compared across environments. Qualitative data, such as interviews and resident journals, provide texture that numbers alone cannot show. A resident might write that they finally slept through the night because they could see the exit door, something no scale would capture. Another might explain that they avoided the commons not because it was uncomfortable, but because they feared conflict with others. These details allow designers to refine spaces with greater sensitivity. Another consideration is time. A single night in a prototype may show immediate reactions, but not deeper patterns. A week-long stay may reveal whether comfort grows or erodes. At first, a resident might enjoy the open commons, but after several days, they may seek more defined boundaries. Tracking these shifts over time provides insight into adaptation. Some features may work only in the short term, while others hold value in the long term. Iteration also extends beyond design details to broader environmental factors. Noise levels, staff presence, and rules for use all influence how residents perceive space. A well-designed alcove loses value if staff hover nearby. A movable wall becomes pointless if residents are told they cannot touch it. Part of the experiment involves testing not only physical design, but also the culture of use. Allowing residents to make choices is as important as giving them the physical means to do so. In some cases, the experiment may highlight contradictions. Residents may say they dislike privacy nooks, but then spend long hours in them. They may claim they value openness, but arrange furniture to create enclosures. These inconsistencies reveal the complex relationship people have with space. Trauma does not always lead to predictable behavior, and preferences may shift depending on mood, trust, or group dynamics. Recording both what people say and what they do prevents the study from oversimplifying results. At each stage, iteration turns the shelter into a living laboratory. Walls move, furniture rotates, lighting shifts, and rules adapt. The goal is not to reach a final design, but to learn the range of environments that residents can tolerate and even embrace. Over time, patterns emerge. Some elements remain stable across groups, such as the need for multiple exits or the value of natural light. Others vary widely, such as tolerance for color, decoration, or enclosed sleeping pods. These findings provide guidance for future shelters while respecting the diversity of experiences among unhoused people. By combining baseline measures, prototype intervention, detailed observation, and iterative adjustment, this experiment creates a cycle of learning. It avoids assuming what residents need and instead builds knowledge from their direct responses. The process is slow, deliberate, and deeply tied to human experience. It shows that design is not a static solution, but an ongoing dialogue between space and the people who inhabit it. The implications of designing shelters that avoid the pressure of domestication reach far beyond the walls of a single building. For homelessness services, this approach suggests a fundamental shift in priorities. Instead of pushing every person toward the idea of a home, service providers could offer neutral spaces that allow rest, safety, and recovery without demanding attachment. A neutral refuge means a person can enter without feeling that they are being told how to live. It avoids the assumption that everyone seeks the same outcome. In practice, this might look like shelters that resemble studios or workshops rather than apartments. Movable partitions, simple furnishings, and open commons would replace the standardized rows of beds or rigid family-style units. The focus would be on giving control back to the resident, not on recreating a home they may associate with harm. This shift also helps address the problem of avoidance. Many unhoused people stay away from shelters because they carry painful memories of institutional settings. A neutral and flexible refuge signals something different. It says, "This is a space where you can pause, not a place that insists on permanence." For service systems, this change demands new forms of training and management. Staff would need to learn how to support autonomy rather than enforce compliance. Rules designed to mimic household order, such as strict curfews or assigned chores, might give way to policies that focus on safety, respect, and choice. A resident who wants to move a chair, adjust a screen, or choose a sleeping alcove would be free to do so without staff interference. This does not mean chaos, but rather a framework built on trust. The neutral refuge can serve as a middle ground between street life and conventional housing. It becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. In this way, homelessness services expand beyond crisis containment and toward genuine recovery. The architectural field also feels the weight of this idea. Designers have long worked with the concept of home as a base unit of practice. Apartments, houses, and dormitories set the framework for most projects. To design for those who reject home forces a break from this tradition. Architects must ask, what if the ideal is not permanence, but adaptability? What if comfort comes from open choice rather than enclosure? This question expands the definition of home. A gallery or studio can become a model for refuge, a flexible grid of space where residents can alter walls, change furniture, and shift lighting, challenges the fixed blueprint of a domestic interior. The emphasis shifts from ownership to use. Instead of giving each person a room with a door, the designer may create pods, alcoves, and shared commons that can morph with need. Consider the way museums or libraries handle space. They allow people to gather, linger, or retreat without requiring ownership. A person may sit in a reading corner for hours, then leave without leaving a mark. Shelters can borrow from these models. A space designed as a neutral refuge may look closer to a workshop with movable tables than a row of small bedrooms. This type of architecture does not erase the value of homes, but widens the scope of what designers consider livable space. It acknowledges that for some, a sense of safety comes not from walls, but from the ability to move, see exits, and control proximity. This expands architectural ethics as well, urging designers to listen to psychological needs as much as structural codes. For psychology, the implications are equally important. Trauma often shapes the way people respond to environments. A closed door may feel protective to one person and trapping to another. A shared meal in a communal room may build trust for some, but spark panic in others. By studying how people interact with neutral shelters, psychologists gain insight into how trauma, autonomy, and identity connect to space. This moves the field beyond therapy rooms and into the built environment. A person's ability to recover may depend not only on counseling, but also on whether their shelter offers freedom to shape space. One scenario illustrates this point. A man who survived years of domestic violence may associate bedrooms with fear. In a traditional shelter, he avoids the assigned bed and spends nights outside. In a neutral refuge, he chooses a semi-private nook with open sightlines to exits. He finally sleeps. This single choice reveals how trauma, design, and well-being intertwine. Psychologists studying his response can better understand how autonomy in physical space restores trust. Over time, these lessons feed back into therapy and policy, showing that recovery requires both safe relationships and safe environments. Identity also plays a role. Many unhoused people resist shelters because they fear being stripped of individuality. Uniform cots, strict schedules, and institutional walls reinforce the feeling of being controlled. A flexible shelter that allows personal choice, even in small ways, helps restore identity. Choosing where to sit, how to arrange a screen, or which alcove to use becomes more than a practical act. It becomes a statement of self. Psychology recognizes that identity is not abstract but embodied. Where and how we live shapes who we feel we are. By providing spaces that support autonomy, shelters can help residents reconnect with a sense of agency. the implications stretch further into policy and public perception. If services adopt neutral shelters, the stigma around homelessness may shift. Instead of seeing shelters as punitive warehouses, communities may view them as humane places of rest and transition. Architects may present them not as temporary fixes, but as experiments in flexible design. Psychologists may use them as living laboratories for studying trauma recovery in real-world settings. Together, these changes can influence how cities allocate resources and how the public understands the needs of unhoused people. The broader lesson is that design cannot be separated from human psychology. For decades, shelters have been built to manage populations rather than to respect them. The move toward neutral, flexible refuge recognizes that autonomy is as vital as food or a bed. When services provide choice, when architects design with openness, and when psychologists study how space shapes identity, the result is a system better aligned with human needs. These implications demand careful thought, but also open new possibilities. Testing whether trauma-informed, flexible design improves safety and dignity requires a clear experimental setup that can be reproduced across contexts. The first step is to identify what will be measured and how those measurements differ from the practices used in traditional dormitory shelters. A dorm model often places dozens of beds in one large room, with little privacy and only one or two exits. Residents must adapt to the environment rather than shaping it. In contrast, the prototype non-home shelter relies on movable partitions, opt-in privacy nooks, multiple exits, and furniture that can be rearranged. To test which model better supports safety and dignity, both subjective and objective data are needed. Subjective data comes from residents themselves. Surveys and interviews can track feelings of safety, control, and well-being before, during, and after their stay. Residents can describe whether they slept, whether they felt trapped, and whether they experienced stress during routine shelter activities. Self-reports may include scales for fear, comfort, and autonomy, as well as open questions that capture nuance. Objective data can track physiological signs such as heart rate variability, cortisol levels, or sleep quality using non-invasive wearables. Behavioral observations can record how often residents move partitions, how much time they spend in community spaces, and whether they choose to use private nooks. Staff can log incidents of conflict, rule violation, or medical emergencies, providing another layer of measurable difference. Together, these forms of data establish a baseline for traditional dorm shelters and a comparison point for the prototype. The hypothesis guiding the experiment is straightforward. If design accounts for trauma and autonomy, then residents will report higher safety and dignity. This includes sleeping more consistently, avoiding panic responses, and engaging more often with communal areas by choice rather than compulsion. The presence of multiple exits should reduce fight or flight responses triggered by confinement. Movable partitions should support a sense of control, which reduces stress. Shared but reconfigurable furniture should allow social interactions without enforcing them. If these assumptions hold true, the prototype should demonstrate measurable improvements compared to the dormitory model. Consider a scenario that highlights the difference. In a dorm, a resident with a history of incarceration may lie awake, scanning the room for threats, unable to rest because he cannot see the exits. In the prototype, he can place his bedding near an open sightline and adjust a lightweight partition to create a sense of boundary. The experiment would track whether he sleeps through the night in one setting and not the other. Another resident might panic when forced to share a bunk with strangers. In the prototype, she can choose a semi-private nook or alcove. Measurement would capture whether her self-reported anxiety decreases and whether she stays longer in the shelter. These cases help clarify how design translates into outcomes. Scalability is another important element. A single prototype cannot solve homelessness, but it can serve as a model for shelters that adapt to diverse populations. The design must be modular so that cities or service agencies can replicate it at different scales. One approach is to standardize units that can expand or contract depending on space. For example, a cluster of movable partitions, lightweight furniture, and modular flooring could be installed in a vacant gymnasium, a warehouse, or a community center. Instead of fixed construction, the system would resemble a kit of parts. Each kit could provide several pods, privacy nooks, and communal commons, all of which can be rearranged. This reduces costs and allows the design to be set up quickly in emergencies such as natural disasters. Adaptability also matters for serving different groups. Families, individuals, youth, and elders may have different needs. A family may require adjoining pods that allow supervision of children while preserving privacy from strangers. An elder may prefer an alcove near an exit with fewer steps to navigate. A teenager may want a cocoon-like nook away from crowds. The prototype's modularity allows these differences to be addressed without creating separate facilities. Staff training would emphasize how to help residents configure the space rather than assigning them to predetermined beds. To ensure the experiment is rigorous, it should be carried out in stages. Stage 1 could involve a small-scale trial with a few participants, comparing responses between the dorm model and the prototype. Stage 2 could expand to a larger population, tracking trends over weeks or months. Data should be analyzed by independent researchers to reduce bias. Results should be shared with service providers, architects, and policymakers. By grounding the experiment in measurable outcomes, the design can move from concept to policy influence. Funding and policy alignment will shape how market-ready the model becomes. Traditional shelters often rely on government contracts or nonprofit grants that reward efficiency of scale rather than quality of experience. To make the prototype viable, funding frameworks must recognize the value of trauma-informed design. This may require cost-benefit analysis, showing that reducing stress, conflict, and emergency incidents saves money in the long term. For example, if fewer medical emergencies occur because residents feel safer, the shelter reduces strain on hospitals. If fewer conflicts escalate to police calls, the city reduces law enforcement costs. These savings can offset the expense of modular design kits. Another important consideration is community perception. Traditional shelters often face opposition from neighbors who fear disorder. A prototype designed as a flexible, non-institutional space may appear less threatening. Its resemblance to a studio or gallery rather than a warehouse can reduce stigma. This perception makes adoption easier, which is part of scalability. Cities may be more willing to fund and host shelters that feel like humane refuges rather than containment zones. The market-ready experiment also relies on collaboration between disciplines. Architects design the modular systems, psychologists develop measurement tools, service providers manage operations, and policymakers adjust regulations. For example, building codes may need to adapt to allow movable partitions as official room dividers. Fire codes must account for multiple exits and reconfigurable layouts. Partnerships with technology companies can supply wearable devices for tracking sleep or stress. Collaboration ensures the prototype does not remain a one-off, but becomes a repeatable model. In scaling to diverse, vulnerable populations, the prototype also addresses broader crises. Refugees, disaster survivors, and people displaced by climate events often resist being placed in rigid camps that feel institutional. Flexible refuge can meet their needs with dignity. This extends the experiment beyond homelessness to global humanitarian response. The same kit of modular parts used in a city shelter could be shipped to an area struck by an earthquake, giving survivors safety without confinement. The final layer of the setup involves public communication. Transparency about goals, methods, and outcomes helps build trust. Residents must know their feedback shapes the design. Staff must see data not as surveillance, but as a way to improve services. Policymakers and funders must understand that safety and dignity are measurable outcomes, not abstract ideals. By grounding the experiment in clarity, the prototype can move from theory to widespread practice. The market-ready experiment, then, is both practical and ambitious. It measures how space affects trauma, compares flexible design with dormitory models, and prepares a path for scaling to diverse contexts. If the hypothesis holds true, the result is a new kind of shelter that restores dignity through design. The question that sits at the center of this inquiry is whether a home can exist without feeling like a home in the traditional sense. For many, home means comfort, permanence, ownership, and familiarity. Yet for those who carry trauma or who have experienced harm within such spaces, these same qualities can represent confinement, loss of control, or even danger. The experiment in rethinking shelter design asks whether home can instead be understood as a condition of safety, autonomy, and freedom, rather than as a fixed domestic model. The answer that emerges through design and psychological reflection is yes. Home can exist outside of domesticity, built not on ownership or permanence, but on choice, adaptability, and respect for individual thresholds of comfort. This shift begins with trauma-informed refuges that avoid replicating the domestic cues that trigger unease. Instead of forcing an unhoused person to step into a replica of middle-class domestic space, these environments allow them to shape their own boundaries. A resident may choose to close off a nook for privacy or leave partitions open for social interaction. They may settle near an exit for reassurance or in the center of the commons for connection. The space does not dictate belonging, but invites it. By giving control back to the resident, the shelter transforms from an institution into a refuge, even if it avoids the aesthetic of a home. One way to understand this is through contrast. In a dormitory shelter, residents often feel they must adapt to rigid systems, bed assignments, shared bathrooms, fixed lights-off hours. These conditions mirror the disciplinary structures of prisons or camps. Many avoid such shelters not because they do not want shelter, but because these systems deny them dignity and control. A trauma-informed refuge, however, starts with the recognition that survival depends not just on a roof, but on psychological safety. Offering freedom of choice, even simple ones like where to sleep or whether to create a boundary, affirms autonomy and interrupts cycles of trauma. In this sense, the shelter functions as a home not because it resembles domestic life, but because it honors personal agency. The broader implication is that the idea of home itself is in flux. The future of home may not rest on permanence or ownership, but on adaptability. For centuries, home has been tied to land, property, and long-term settlement. Yet increasing mobility, economic instability, climate migration, and cultural shifts are making permanence less reliable. In this context, home becomes less about fixed walls and more about conditions that create safety and belonging. A gallery, studio, or modular refuge can provide the functions of home without the symbols of domesticity. What matters is not the appearance of homeliness, but the lived experience of dignity and control. Consider how this reframing applies beyond homelessness. Refugees displaced by war often resist permanent camps because they feel like prisons. Survivors of natural disasters may fear being housed in rows of identical trailers. In both cases, the physical structures offer shelter, but not refuge. By introducing modular, fluid environments that prioritize freedom of movement and self-organization, relief efforts could provide spaces that function as temporary homes without enforcing domesticity. The same holds true for youth aging out of foster care, for victims of domestic violence, or for those who leave institutions like prisons or hospitals. In each case, a trauma-informed refuge can provide stability without demanding assimilation into a traditional notion of home. The redefinition also challenges architecture as a discipline. Architects have long designed houses as symbols of stability and family life. Yet the need now is for flexible, non-domestic refuges that expand the language of home. This requires rejecting some assumptions that home must have a living room, kitchen, and bedroom in fixed arrangement. Instead, design can center adaptability, multiplicity, and open-ended use. A pod with adjustable walls can be a bedroom one night and a study the next. A commons can host meals in the morning and art workshops at night. The architecture of refuge shifts from reproducing domestic patterns to enabling choice. For psychology, this experiment adds depth to how environments interact with trauma and identity. Place attachment theory has often assumed that stability and familiarity are the foundations of well-being. But for those who have experienced abuse or neglect in the home, attachment to traditional domestic settings may be fraught. A non-home refuge allows researchers to map resistance thresholds. At what point does a space feel too much like a house, and when does it instead support healing? The answers can inform not only shelter design, but also therapeutic environments, schools, and public spaces. If autonomy and choice are core to psychological safety, then every setting should be examined through that lens. In practice, the future of home may be defined by fluidity. Ownership, permanence, and inheritance may still matter for some, but for many others, safety will come from spaces that are flexible, portable, and responsive. Housing cooperatives, co-living experiments, and even short-term modular housing systems already hint at this shift. A modular refuge that can be disassembled, moved, and reassembled challenges the notion that home must be tied to a single place. Instead, it becomes a portable condition of safety shaped by those who use it. The provocation, then, is whether society is ready to embrace a future where home is no longer a fixed ideal, but a flexible state of being. This is not a rejection of domesticity for those who find comfort in it. Rather, it is an expansion of possibility. A trauma-informed refuge can sit alongside traditional homes, offering an alternative for those who need it. By accepting that home can exist without domesticity, we allow a broader range of human experiences to be honored. For some, this will mean returning to conventional houses. For others, it will mean living in spaces that avoid the cues of confinement and permanence. What emerges is a vision of home rooted in freedom, choice, and agency. This vision insists that home is not defined by walls, ownership, or permanence, but by the lived experience of safety and dignity. The question, can a home exist without feeling like home, receives an affirmative answer. The more challenging question is whether society is willing to accept such a shift, to fund it, and to design for it. If we do, the future of home will be more expansive, inclusive, and humane, shaped less by conformity and more by the needs of those who have long been excluded from the stability others take for granted.